Every man in Millhaven looked at Evelyn Blackwood and saw a future worth having. Caleb Whitmore walked into that trading post, looked past the most beautiful woman in the territory, and pointed at her older sister instead, the one with the scar, the one they called useless, the one nobody ever saw. What happened next broke every rule the frontier believed in. Stay with me until the very end, because this story will remind you that the people the world overlooks are sometimes the ones carrying everything. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far these voices travel. Subscribe and join our family so you never miss what comes next. The Blackwood Trading Post had been dying for 3 years. Not dramatically, not the way a building burns or a river floods. It was the slow kind of dying, the kind that happens in increments so small you almost convince yourself things are fine. A crack in the supply ledger here, a debt left unpaid there. Winter coming in harder than the season before, stripping another layer of paint off the front boards, warping another section of the rear storage wall until it sat crooked on its frame and let the cold wind slice straight through the gaps. Clara Blackwood knew the numbers better than anyone. She sat with them every night after her daughters went to bed, spreading the accounts across the kitchen table by lamplight, running her finger down columns that never added up the way she needed them to. The post had been her husband's dream first, then her burden after he died of a fever 6 years ago, leaving her with 2 daughters, a building full of debt, and a town that offered more sympathy than actual help. The town of Millhaven, Montana Territory, was not a cruel place exactly. It was just practical. People out here on the frontier respected what they could see and measure. How much a man could haul, how fast a woman could cook, how many cattle a ranch could run through a bad winter. Abstract things like loyalty and quiet effort didn't hold much weight at the general store when you needed credit. What the town of Millhaven could see was Evelyn Blackwood. Evelyn was 22 and the kind of beautiful that made men forget what they'd walked into a room to say. Tall, with dark hair she wore pinned loosely, so strands of it always seemed to be escaping in ways that looked accidental but weren't, and a smile that she deployed with the precise timing of someone who understood its effect. She was not mean-spirited. That was the complicated part. She genuinely believed she was kind. She helped customers, laughed easily, remembered names and small personal details that made people feel seen and liked. The whole town adored her, and she adored being adored, and for a long time that circular arrangement had kept things relatively peaceful in the Blackwood household. What the town could not see, or chose not to, was Mara. Mara Blackwood was 26, 4 years older than her sister, and she had been invisible in Millhaven for so long that she'd almost stopped noticing it herself. She was a large woman, heavier than the frontier ideal, with wide hips and thick arms and a build that the women of the town described as unfortunate when they were being polite and considerably worse when they weren't. There was a scar along her left cheek, a pale ridge of healed skin that ran from just below her cheekbone down to the edge of her jaw. The remnant of a childhood accident involving a broken barrel hoop that nobody much remembered anymore except Mara, who felt it every morning when she washed her face. She was not beautiful in any way the town recognized. What she was necessary. And necessary, she had learned, was an entirely different thing from valued. Every morning, Mara rose before the sun came up, not because anyone asked her to, but because the post needed things done that wouldn't get done otherwise. She had repaired the buckled storage wall herself with lumber she'd bartered for, patching and re-nailing until the wind stopped getting through. She kept the supply inventory in her own handwriting, tight, precise columns that tracked every bolt of fabric, every pound of flour, every length of rope. Because the previous system had been her father's improvised shorthand, and after he died, nobody could read it. She had started growing medicinal herbs behind the building 2 years ago, a small kitchen garden that had since expanded to 3 full rows of yarrow and comfrey and willow bark, because doctoring out here cost money they didn't have, and people got hurt doing the kind of work the frontier required. She had also, twice now, negotiated directly with the supply wagons out of Billings when Clara was too ill to leave the back room. She'd gotten them better terms both times. Neither the wagon masters nor her mother had made much of it. The town, if asked to describe Mara Blackwood, would have said, "Oh, Clara's other daughter, the big one. She works hard, I suppose." And then they would have moved on to talk about Evelyn. It was the second week of October when Caleb Whitmore rode into Millhaven. Mara was on her knees behind the post when he arrived, repacking a crate of canned goods that had shifted during unloading and split one of the slats along the bottom. She heard the horse first, a heavier animal than most people in town rode, the hoofbeats deliberate and unhurried, and then she heard the sound of people adjusting their attention, that small collective shift in conversation that happened whenever someone significant entered a space. She didn't get up to look. She finished repacking the crate, tied it with rope, and stood up and wiped her hands on her apron. By the time she came around to the front of the building, Caleb Whitmore was already inside. She'd heard of him, the way you heard of everyone in a territory this size. He owned the Whitmore Ranch up in the high country, north of the pass, roughly 40 miles from Millhaven over terrain that turned impassable for weeks at a time in winter. He'd built it himself starting when he was 24 with nothing but a land grant and enough stubbornness to outlast 3 consecutive brutal winters. He was 38 now. The ranch was productive, cattle mostly, some horses, and he employed a small crew of men who, by all accounts, would follow him through just about anything. He had been married once, early on, to a woman who hadn't lasted 2 years in the high country before the isolation broke something in her and she'd left, taking nothing but the clothes she arrived in. He hadn't remarried. Millhaven knew all of this. Millhaven also knew, because these things traveled faster than supply wagons, that Caleb Whitmore was looking for a wife. Clara Blackwood had known it for 2 weeks. She'd had 2 separate conversations about it with the preacher's wife and one with the woman who ran the boarding house, all of them arriving at the same conclusion. If Caleb Whitmore could be persuaded to court Evelyn, the Blackwood family's financial situation would change overnight. Mara had overheard one of these conversations through the wall of the back storeroom. She hadn't said anything about it to anyone. Inside the trading post, Caleb Whitmore was not what Mara had pictured. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Some swaggering mountain figure, probably. The kind of man who filled a room with noise and took up more space than his body required. Instead, he was standing quietly by the counter, looking at the supply display with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders and weathered in the way that happened to people who spent most of their lives outside. His face was angular, cut by windburn and sun into hard lines. He had dark hair shot through with gray at the temples, and eyes that were a complicated brownish gray, the color of creek water in November. He was not handsome in any polished way. He looked like a man who had made peace with being useful rather than impressive. Clara was already positioned at the counter, her best smile deployed. Evelyn had materialized from somewhere. She had an instinct for moments like this, and was standing slightly behind her mother, just far enough back to create the impression of modesty while remaining absolutely visible. "Mr. Whitmore," Clara said, with the warmth she could produce when she needed it. "We've been hoping you'd stop in. I'm Clara Blackwood. This is my daughter, Evelyn." Caleb Whitmore looked at Evelyn. Evelyn smiled. It was the smile, the one she'd been using since she was 15. It had never failed her yet. Caleb nodded politely. "Miss Blackwood," he said. His voice was low and even, not unfriendly. And then his eyes moved past her. Mara had come in through the side door and was standing near the back shelves, in the process of recording something in the supply ledger. She was not dressed for being noticed. She was wearing her work apron over a dark dress that had been mended at the hem twice, her hair pulled back in a practical knot, a smudge of dust along her forearm from the crate work. The scar on her cheek caught the afternoon light coming through the window. She looked up from the ledger because she felt the weight of attention shift, the same way you feel a change in air pressure before weather. Caleb Whitmore was looking directly at her. She looked back at him with the flat, honest expression she used when she wasn't sure what was happening but didn't intend to pretend otherwise. He didn't look away. Clara noticed and stepped smoothly into the moment. "And that's Mara," she said, with the particular tone that managed to convey both acknowledgement and dismissal simultaneously. "She handles the stock." "I can see that," Caleb said. He said it like it meant something. Then he turned back to Clara and placed a supply order that he could have gotten at any number of posts between here and the pass, and he stayed an hour, and he accepted the coffee Evelyn brought him and answered her questions politely. He was not rude to anyone. He did not single out Mara again. But Mara had seen the way he looked at her, and she had also seen, in the same moment, the faint puzzlement cross his face as he registered the rest of the room's assumptions about where his attention was supposed to land. She wrote it off as her own imagination. She was good at writing things off. He came back 4 days later. This time he arrived in the morning when Clara was in the back dealing with a supplier dispute and Evelyn was still upstairs getting dressed. Mara was alone behind the counter, working through the week's accounts. "Miss Blackwood," he said when the bell above the door announced him. She looked up. "Mr. Whitmore, my mother isn't available right now, but I can help you with a supply order if that's—" "I didn't come for supplies," he said. He crossed to the counter and stopped a few feet away, turning his hat in his hands again. "I have a question I'd like to ask you directly, if that's all right." Mara put down her pencil. "All right." "Are you spoken for?" The question landed in the air between them. Mara stared at him. Outside, a cart went by on the main street, wheels grinding against frozen mud. Somewhere upstairs, Evelyn's footsteps moved across the floor. "No," Mara said, "I'm not." "Good," Caleb said. He seemed to be choosing his words the way a man picks his footing on uncertain ground. Not slow exactly, but careful. "I'll be honest with you because I think you're someone who'd rather have honesty than a performance. I need a wife, not a decoration, not someone who expects a certain kind of life that the high country can't provide. I need a partner who can think clearly when things go wrong, and things go wrong up there more often than not." He paused. "I've been watching how this post runs. Your mother is working hard, your sister is charming, but you're the one keeping this place on its feet. I can see the difference between someone who performs and someone who carries." Mara didn't speak immediately. Her hands were flat on the counter, and she was aware of exactly how strange this moment was, how far outside any story she'd ever expected her life to contain. "You don't know me," she said. "You've been in this post twice." "That's true, which is why I'm asking permission to change that." He met her eyes steadily. "I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm asking if you're willing to let me ask." Before Mara could answer, footsteps came down the stairs. Evelyn appeared in the doorway. She had clearly heard part of it, enough at least to understand the shape of the conversation. Her expression went through several things at once: confusion, then disbelief, then something sharp and hurt that she recovered from fast enough that a less perceptive person might have missed it. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I didn't know you were here." "Miss Evelyn." He nodded, polite as ever. "I was just speaking with your sister." The silence that followed was one of those silences that could fill a room from floor to ceiling. Evelyn looked at Mara. Mara looked back at her sister with an expression that was, if anything, as surprised as Evelyn's. "I see," Evelyn said. Her voice was perfectly controlled. It was one of her gifts. That voice never cracked when she needed it not to. "Of course." She went back upstairs. Mara heard the bedroom door close. Not slammed. That was almost worse. She looked back at Caleb Whitmore, who was watching her with a patience that didn't seem performed. "You understand," she said carefully, "what you're stepping into." "I expect I do," he said. "I've been in complicated situations before." "This isn't the high country kind of complicated," she said. "This is family." "I know what family is," he said quietly. Something moved in his expression. Not pain exactly, but the memory of it. "I'm not asking to make things easy. I'm asking if there's room for something real." Mara was quiet for a long moment. The accounts ledger was still open beside her, column after column of numbers she had kept in order for 3 years, while the world looked past her at her sister. "Come back on Friday," she said, finally. "We can talk more then." Caleb Whitmore nodded once. He put his hat on. He walked out. Mara stood at the counter for a moment after the bell above the door stopped moving, and she looked at her own hands on the ledger, and she thought about what it felt like to be seen, really seen, in the specific and particular way that this strange, careful man had looked at her. Not through her, not past her, but at her. She had absolutely no idea what to do with that. The town found out by the end of the week. Millhaven was not a large place, and it had the information habits of a small place. Fast, thorough, occasionally embellished. By the time Caleb Whitmore made his third visit to the Blackwood Post, half the women in town knew he was not coming to see Evelyn, and the other half were in the process of being told. The response was what Mara might have predicted, if she'd let herself think about it. At the general store, Mrs. Garfield paused in her conversation to watch Mara pass on the street outside, and then said to the woman beside her, very quietly, but not quietly enough, "I suppose he wants someone who'll do the cooking without complaining." This was considered an insight worth repeating. At the post itself, a man named Duval, who ran cattle south of town, stopped in for rope and spent 5 full minutes looking between Mara and the door through which Caleb had just exited, with an expression of such genuine bafflement that he forgot to count his change. And Evelyn. Evelyn was the hardest part. Not because she was cruel, she wasn't, not openly, but because she was present, all the time, moving through the post with the particular quality of someone who has been wronged and hasn't decided yet how much to show it. She spoke to Mara normally. She helped customers normally. But there was a new distance in her, a careful management of their proximity that hadn't existed before. And Mara felt it the way you feel a bruise you haven't looked at yet. 3 days after Caleb's second visit, Evelyn came to find her in the herb garden behind the post. Mara was on her knees, cutting back the yarrow before the hard frost came. "You should have told me," Evelyn said. Mara sat back on her heels and looked up at her sister. "I didn't know he was going to say what he said. It happened in front of me, same as it would have happened in front of you." "He came looking for a wife," Evelyn said. "Everyone knew that. Everyone was—" She stopped. "Mama had plans." "I know she did. And you don't care." Mara was quiet for a moment, turning a sprig of yarrow in her fingers. The sky above them was going gray at the edges, the kind of gray that meant serious cold was coming. "It's not that I don't care," she said. "It's that he didn't ask Mama what her plans were. He asked me." Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. Her face was doing something complicated that Mara recognized. The expression Evelyn wore when she was confronting something that didn't fit inside the version of the world she'd built around herself. "You're really considering it," Evelyn said. Less accusation now, more something like wonder. "I'm talking to him," Mara said. "I'm not promising anything." "The ranch is isolated, Mara. It's weeks from here in winter. You'd be—" "I know what it is," Mara said. She said it quietly, not sharp, but final. "He told me." Evelyn crossed her arms against the cold. She looked away toward the mountains on the northern horizon, where the peaks were already white. "I just don't understand," she said, not to Mara exactly, more to the distance. "You." The word landed small and honest, nothing deliberate about it. Evelyn wasn't trying to be cruel. She genuinely didn't understand, and the genuine part was somehow the thing that stung most, because it meant that everyone around Mara had been so certain she was invisible for so long that even the people who loved her had stopped questioning it. Mara looked at her sister and felt the familiar old weight of that, the accumulated years of being the one nobody accounted for. And then she felt underneath it something else, something new and uncertain that she didn't have a name for yet. She went back to cutting the yarrow. "Help me get this inside before the frost takes it," she said. After a moment, Evelyn knelt beside her and started cutting. They worked together in the cold without speaking, and it was the most honest thing they'd done with each other in years. On Friday, Caleb Whitmore came back as promised. Clara made tea and sat in the front room with them, which was not a subtle arrangement, but Mara hadn't expected subtlety. What she hadn't expected was Caleb's expression when Clara laid out what the family needed. Not cruelly, but plainly, the numbers and the debts named with a directness that was its own kind of desperation. He listened. He didn't look embarrassed or irritated. He asked 2 specific questions about the debt structure. He looked at Mara while asking them. Later, when Clara stepped out on a pretext that convinced nobody, Caleb leaned forward slightly across the small table between them. "She needs you to do this," he said. "I want you to know I understand that. And I want you to decide anyway, not for her, for yourself." Mara looked at him. The lamp on the table put warm light on one side of his face and left the other in shadow, and it occurred to her that this was a man who was also more complicated than a single angle would show. "What do you actually want?" she asked him. "Not what you need, not what makes the ranch work. What do you want?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "I want someone to talk to," he said finally. "Up there, in the winters. Someone who isn't performing a version of a life for my benefit. Someone who's actually there." It was not a romantic answer. It was not poetry or fire. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. "I'll consider it," she said. "That's all I'm asking," he said. Outside the window, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, coming down light and steady over Millhaven, covering the frozen mud of the main street and the cracked boards of the trading post porch, and everything the town thought it knew about what was possible. Mara watched it come down and thought, the world is going to have a lot of opinions about this. She thought, let it. The snow that had started falling on Friday night did not stop until Sunday morning, and by then Millhaven had 3 inches of it on every flat surface and a fresh set of opinions about the Blackwood situation that were circulating faster than the cold. Mara heard most of them secondhand. She heard them in the way people in small towns communicate displeasure, not directly, never directly, but in the pauses before greetings, in the way conversation shifted when she walked into the general store, in the particular quality of Mrs. Garfield's smile that contained everything except warmth. The town had decided something about what was happening, and what it had decided was that Caleb Whitmore was either confused or desperate, and that Mara Blackwood was, depending on who was doing the talking, either cunning enough to have engineered the situation or too simple to understand that she was heading toward something she wouldn't be able to manage. Nobody considered the possibility that Caleb simply knew what he wanted. That possibility apparently required a kind of imagination Millhaven didn't have in large supply. Clara said nothing directly either, which was its own form of pressure. She moved through the post with an altered energy. Not angry, not quite, more like a woman who has revised her calculations and isn't sure yet whether the new numbers work. She asked Mara twice in the first days after Caleb's Friday visit whether she'd made any decisions. Mara told her twice that she was still thinking. Clara accepted this with a tightness around her mouth that communicated volumes about how long she was prepared to wait. The debt was real. Mara knew that. She'd been managing the ledger long enough to understand exactly how precarious the post's position had become. The outstanding balance with the billing supplier, the loan on the roof repair, the slow erosion of winter trade as more customers made the longer trip to the newer, better-stocked post that had opened up in Hargrove 2 seasons ago. Clara's plan had never been cold or mercenary. It had been survival, dressed up in the available clothes. Evelyn was beautiful and charming, and a prosperous match would solve problems that hard work alone wasn't solving anymore. The problem was that Caleb Whitmore hadn't read the plan. And Mara, for the first time in 26 years, was being asked to choose something for herself. She wasn't sure she knew how. She was at the counter on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after Caleb's last visit, when Duval came in. Nate Duval was not a bad man. He ran a decent cattle operation south of town, paid his debts on time, and had never been deliberately unkind to Mara in all the years she'd known him. He was also the kind of man who said exactly what he was thinking at any given moment, with the confidence of someone who had never had much reason to edit himself. He bought his rope, made conversation with Clara about the weather, and then, on his way to the door, stopped and looked at Mara with that same expression of bafflement she'd seen from him before. "You know Whitmore came into Halsey's last night," he said. Mara looked up from the ledger. "All right." "He was asking about the Blackwood post. Not your sister, you specifically." Duval said it like he was reporting something that defied natural law. "Ask Thomas Halsey how long you'd been running the accounts here, how the post managed its winter supply situation, what you did for the town in terms of doctoring." He shook his head slowly. "Sounds like a man doing inventory on a purchase." "Then I suppose that's what he's doing," Mara said. "Mara." He lowered his voice, not out of discretion, but out of a kind of rough kindness. "That ranch is 40 miles into the high country. It's not a life for most people." He caught himself before finishing whatever he'd started to say, which meant she could fill in the rest without any help. "I appreciate the concern," she said. She looked back down at the ledger. Duval stood there for another moment, turning his hat in his hands. She noticed men did that when they didn't know what to do with themselves. And then he left, Clara appeared from the back room approximately 30 seconds later, which meant she had heard all of it. He's not wrong about the ranch, Clara said carefully. I know, Mara said. It's a hard life up there. Isolated, dangerous in winter. Mama, Mara set down her pencil. I've been managing this post through 3 hard winters while you were sick. I've stitched wounds and set a broken arm and talked down a man who came in here drunk and threatening during the supply shortage 2 years ago. I know what hard looks like. Clara was quiet for a moment. She sat down in the chair behind the counter, the one she used when her back was giving her trouble, and she looked at Mara with an expression that was harder to read than her usual ones. There was something in it that wasn't calculation, something older than that. You deserve to be happy, Clara said finally. I want you to know I believe that. I know you do, Mara said, but wanting something for yourself and… Clara stopped, started again. Just be sure he's not choosing you because you're useful to him. You deserve more than being useful to someone. Mara looked at her mother. It was the most direct thing Clara had said to her about her own worth in years, maybe ever, and it hit somewhere soft and unexpected. He told me he wanted someone to talk to, Mara said. In winter. Someone actually there. Clara blinked. Whatever she'd expected, it wasn't that. Well, she said after a moment, that's a different thing. Evelyn came to her that night, not to argue. That surprised Mara. She'd been half expecting another version of the conversation in the herb garden, the confusion, the hurt trying to work itself into something more manageable. Instead, Evelyn sat on the edge of Mara's bed in the small room at the back of the post that had always been Mara's, the room that got the least light and faced the supply yard, and she looked at her hands in her lap. Tell me about him, Evelyn said. Mara, who had been mending a tear in her work dress by lamplight, looked up. What? Caleb Whitmore. Tell me what he's actually like, when he talks to you. Evelyn's voice was careful. It wasn't the voice she used publicly. I want to understand what I'm not seeing. It was a harder question to answer than it sounded because what Mara kept coming back to was the way he listened, not nodding along, not waiting for his turn to speak, actually listening, the way people did when they were genuinely trying to figure something out. He's honest, she said, not flattering. He told me the ranch was hard before he told me anything else. That's not exactly romantic. No, Mara agreed, but I've had enough people telling me what they thought I wanted to hear. Evelyn was quiet at that. The lamp between them threw uneven light, and Mara could see the complicated work happening behind her sister's face, the effort of trying to understand something that didn't fit inside the world as she'd understood it. He barely looked at me, Evelyn said. Not with vanity. More like a woman trying to solve a problem that shouldn't be a problem. I know that sounds terrible. I'm not saying he should have. I've never had that happen. I know. And I don't know what it means that the first time it happens, he's looking at you. She said it without cruelty. She said it like someone reading aloud a sentence they couldn't quite parse. Not because I think there's something wrong with you. I don't think that. She stopped. I've always been the one people looked at. I know that too, Mara said. And you've been fine with not being looked at. I never said I was fine with it. That landed differently than Mara intended, or maybe exactly as she intended. Evelyn looked up from her hands, and there it was. The thing that never got said between them, sitting in the middle of the room now like a piece of furniture they'd both been walking around for years. Mara had not been fine with it. She had managed it, which was a completely different thing, and somewhere along the way the management had gotten confused with acceptance. I didn't know, Evelyn said softly. You weren't supposed to have to, Mara said. It wasn't your problem. It should have been. Evelyn's voice came out smaller than usual. We're sisters. Mara set her mending down. She looked at Evelyn, her beautiful sister, who had never once asked to be the favorite, who had simply been born into a role the world assigned her before she had any choice in the matter, same as Mara had been born into hers. If he'd chosen you, Mara said, I would have helped you pack. I would have made sure your herbs were sorted and your preserves were labeled and your mending was done. Evelyn looked at her. Her eyes were bright. And now? She asked. Mara picked her mending back up. Now I'm trying to figure out how to pack for myself." Evelyn let out a breath that was almost a laugh, shaky at the edges. She reached out and put her hand over Mara's for a moment, not saying anything, just there. And then she stood up and went back to her own room. Mara sat with the mending and the lamp and the quiet, and she thought, "I've been waiting for someone to give me permission to want something." And she thought, "That's not how it works." Caleb came back on a Wednesday, 12 days after his last visit, and this time he came with two things: a supply list that was the longest she'd seen from him, and a direct question. "I'd like to take you to see the ranch," he said. He said it at the counter, with Clara in the back room and Evelyn occupied upstairs and nobody else in the post. "Before you decide anything, I want you to see it with your own eyes, not imagine it from descriptions." Mara looked at him. "That's a 2-day ride in this weather." "3, if we take it reasonably. I'd have you back in 6 days total. We'd stop at the Harrow homestead the first night. They know me. It's proper." He met her eyes. "I'm not asking you to commit to anything. I'm asking you to look at what you'd be committing to, if you chose to. That seems fair." It was fair. It was also terrifying, which she didn't say. "Give me 2 days to arrange coverage for the post," she said. He nodded. "I'll be at the boarding house." After he left, Mara stood at the counter for a long moment and then went to the back room where her mother was reviewing invoices. "I'm going to see the ranch," she said. Clara set down her papers. She looked at Mara with the careful expression of a woman choosing between several different responses and selecting the most useful one. "All right," she said. "I'll be back in 6 days. The supply order for the Billings wagon is ready. It just needs to go out Friday. Evelyn knows where the account files are." "Mara." Clara stood up. She put her hand on Mara's arm, not dramatically, just a hand on an arm, steady. "Come back knowing what you want. That's all I ask." Mara looked at her mother's hand on her arm and nodded. The ride north took them through country that changed character every few miles. The land below Millhaven was familiar to her, worked and tamed, crossed with fence lines and wagon roads, the mountains visible but distant enough to be scenic rather than threatening. As they rode higher, all of that peeled away. The fence lines disappeared. The wagon roads narrowed to tracks, then to game paths, then to nothing but Caleb's knowledge of the terrain. The trees grew taller and denser, and the light came through them differently, in cold shafts rather than broad open warmth. The mountains stopped being scenic. They were on the second day when Mara said what she'd been holding since they started. "Tell me what happened to your first wife." Caleb, riding slightly ahead of her on a section where the path narrowed, didn't answer immediately. She waited. "Her name was Agnes," he said. "She came from a family in Missouri. She was 20 when we married. I was 27. He was quiet for a moment. "She was not suited to it. Not because she was weak. I want to be clear about that. She was capable. The isolation was a kind of pain she couldn't find a way through. The winters specifically. She'd go weeks without seeing another woman, without hearing music or conversation or anything that reminded her the wider world existed." He paused again. "She told me before she left that she felt like she was disappearing. I didn't understand what she meant until afterward." "Do you understand it now?" Mara asked. "I think so," he said. "I think I chose her for the wrong reasons. I thought wanting someone was enough. I didn't think about whether the life I was offering fit who she actually was." Mara rode for a while with that. The path ahead curved around a rock formation dusted with snow, opening briefly onto a view that took a considerable amount of the available air out of her lungs. A valley below them, white and vast and absolutely still, the kind of stillness that was its own kind of noise. "And you think the life fits me," she said. "I think you're someone who has been doing necessary work in an environment that doesn't see it," he said. "I think you've been carrying things without being asked and without being thanked, and you've done it without breaking." He glanced back at her. "I'm not offering you an easy life. I'm offering you one where the work you do is visible, where it matters to the whole enterprise and everyone knows it." "That's not the same as being wanted," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." He turned back to the trail ahead. "But I'm also offering that. I just don't know how to say it without sounding like I'm performing something I don't mean. Mara looked at his back, the set of his shoulders, the way he rode like a man who'd been on horseback so long, it was just another way of being in a place. So don't perform it, she said. Just say what's true. He was quiet long enough that she thought he'd decided against it. Then, I haven't looked at a woman and thought, there, in a long time, maybe ever, in the way I mean. He said it flatly, like a fact being reported. That first morning in your post. You came around from the back with dust on your arm, and you looked at me like you were calculating exactly what I was worth, and what I was going to cost, and whether the equation made sense. And I thought, that's someone who lives in the actual world, not in a version of it that's been made comfortable for her. He stopped. That's not poetic. I know that. It's more honest than poetic, she said. I figured that's what you'd rather have. It is, she said. They rode on without talking for a while, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who were, for possibly the first time in this situation, saying things they actually meant. The ranch appeared at the end of the third day, as the light was going orange and low behind the western ridge. Mara had tried to prepare herself for it during the ride, building a picture in her mind from Caleb's descriptions and Duval's warnings and her own extrapolations from everything she knew about high country living. She had imagined something weathered and functional and probably smaller than she hoped. She had not imagined the particular way it sat in the land. It wasn't beautiful in any deliberate sense. The main house was large but plain, the barn substantial, the outbuildings arranged with the practical logic of a man who thought about how far he'd need to walk in a blizzard before building anything. There was a creek visible from the front of the house, dark and quick against the snow. The mountain behind it was immediate, not scenic but present, filling the northern sky in a way that made you feel the scale of things. Two of the ranch hands came out when they heard the horses. Young men, both of them, who greeted Caleb with the easy familiarity of people who had spent real time working together. They looked at Mara with curiosity and nothing worse. Inside the house, Mara stood in the front room and looked around while Caleb set a fire in the hearth. The room was functional and somewhat sparse, a table, chairs, shelving, a stone hearth that was clearly the center of the house's warmth. But there were details that told her things. A collection of field identification books on the shelves, worn at the spines. A map of the territory pinned to the wall with notes in the margins. A window on the east side positioned to catch the morning light, which spoke of someone who had thought about where the light would be. The kitchen needs work, Caleb said, without looking up from the fire. I know that. The garden space out back is good, but it's been let go the last 2 seasons. I can see it, she said. The storeroom is through there, he gestured. Cold cellar below. She went and looked at the storeroom. It was exactly what she'd expected. Decent bones, poor organization, the accumulated improvisations of a man managing a practical problem without a system. She stood in the doorway and thought about what she would do with it, and caught herself thinking it, and felt something shift in her chest. She went back to the front room. Caleb was standing by the fire now, watching her. Well, he said. You need a better inventory system, she said. Your cold cellar is going to cost you supplies you can't afford to lose if you don't reorganize the moisture situation down there. The garden space can be made productive again in 1 season if it's started correctly in spring. She looked at him. The house is solid. The land is... It's not what I expected. What did you expect? Something harder to love, she said, before she thought about how that sounded. Caleb looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression moved, not performed, just actual. Is that an answer? He asked. Mara looked at the fire. She thought about the ledger at the post, the columns she'd kept in order for 3 years while the town looked past her. She thought about Evelyn's hand over hers in the lamplight. She thought about her mother's hand on her arm, come back knowing what you want. She thought about what it had felt like for 12 days to be the person a man was coming back to see. Not yet, she said. But it's closer than it was. Caleb nodded. He didn't push. She was learning that about him. He asked once, clearly, and then he waited, and the waiting was not passive. It was a specific kind of respect. They ate supper that night at the table in the main room, the ranch hands joining them, the conversation practical and ordinary. Supply routes, winter preparations, the condition of the north fence line. Mara answered questions when she was asked and asked a few of her own, and she watched how Caleb spoke to his men. Direct, not harsh, willing to say when he didn't know something, willing to be wrong. She filed all of it away. Later, alone in the small guest room off the main hall, she lay awake listening to the ranch settle around her. The creak of the house in the wind, the sound of the creek, the particular deep quiet that existed up here where there was no town noise to fill the dark. She thought, this is what Agnes found unbearable. She thought, I am not Agnes. Not because she was better, because she was different, built differently, by a different life, by years of quiet and necessary work in spaces that didn't notice her. The silence didn't feel like erasure here the way it had sometimes felt in Millhaven, standing behind a counter while the town looked past her. This silence felt like something that could be filled with purpose. She wasn't entirely sure yet what she wanted, but she was no longer unsure that she wanted something, and that, for Mara Blackwood, was the beginning of everything. She said yes on the ride back to Millhaven, not with ceremony, not with the kind of moment that gets remembered and retold at gatherings. She said it on the second day of the return trip, on a flat stretch of trail where the snow had compacted enough for the horses to move side by side. And what she said was, I've made my decision. I'll marry you. Caleb looked at her. He didn't whoop or grab her hand or say anything that would have made the moment into a performance. What he said was, all right, thank you for taking it seriously. I take everything seriously, she said. I noticed, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that she was beginning to understand was as close to a smile as he usually got, without specific cause. They rode the rest of the way into Millhaven with the quiet between them changed. Not heavier, just different, filled with something that hadn't been there on the way up. The wedding was small and functional, the way both of them wanted it. Clara cried, which surprised Mara, and Evelyn stood straight-backed beside her mother and held her chin up and did not cry, which also surprised her. The few guests from town who attended did so with the air of people watching something they hadn't fully decided how to categorize. Duval was there. He shook Caleb's hand and nodded at Mara and said, well, I hope you prove me wrong, which was the most honest wedding blessing she received that day. 2 weeks later, Mara Blackwood became Mara Whitmore and moved 40 miles into the mountains. She packed what mattered: her herb cuttings wrapped in burlap, her account books, the mending kit she'd been using since she was 12, the one good dress she owned that wasn't a work dress, a photograph of her family taken years ago before her father died. She left the rest. There wasn't much of it. Evelyn helped her load the wagon. When everything was packed and there was nothing left to do with their hands, they stood beside the wagon in the supply yard behind the post where they'd had so many of their actual conversations, the ones that happened away from the front room and Clara's management of everything. Write to me, Evelyn said. When I can get letters out, Mara said. Winter can close the pass. Write anyway, even if they don't go until spring. Mara looked at her sister, at her face, which the town had always found easier to look at than Mara's own, which Mara had spent years resenting in the sideways way you resent something that isn't the person's fault. She thought about the night Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed and said, tell me about him. She thought about two women on their knees in the cold, cutting yarrow together in the only honest silence they'd managed in years. I will, she said. She climbed up onto the wagon seat beside Caleb, and she did not let herself look back at the post when they left, because she knew if she looked back, she would start finding reasons to be afraid, and she had decided somewhere on the trail between the ranch and Millhaven that she was done letting fear make her choices. The first winter came fast and mean. October brought snow that stayed. November turned it serious. By December, the ranch was locked in under conditions that Mara had prepared herself for intellectually, but that hit differently in the body. The physical weight of cold that didn't lift, the way the dark came early and stayed, the specific loneliness of standing at the east window in the morning watching a white world that offered nothing back. She had known it would be hard. Knowing didn't make it easier. It just meant she didn't waste energy being surprised. The work was what saved her, and the work was constant. The storeroom reorganization she'd mentally blueprinted on her first visit became her first project, pulling everything out, assessing, reshelving by use frequency and seasonal need, solving the moisture problem in the cold cellar with a drainage channel and fresh sand layering that took her 3 days of cold, filthy work to get right. Caleb's ranch hand, a quiet man named Orrin, who had been with the operation for 6 years, watched her do it with an expression she couldn't read, and then, when she was finished, said, "He's been losing about 10% of his root vegetables every winter to that problem. What you just did is going to matter." "Good," she said, wiping her hands on her work trousers. "Then help me move those salt barrels." Orrin helped move the salt barrels. After that, he stopped looking at her like he was waiting for her to reveal some fundamental unsuitability for the work. The medicinal garden she planned through the winter, drawing maps of what she wanted in the space behind the house, where the yarrow would go, the comfrey, the willow bark saplings she'd brought from the post, the echinacea she'd been growing in pots that she intended to move outside once the ground permitted. Caleb looked at her drawings one evening and traced the layout with one finger. "You're going to need another 12 feet of fence line to protect that from the deer," he said. "I know. Can you spare the material?" "I'll cut it myself in spring," he said. She looked at him across the table. This man she had married, who was still in so many ways a stranger, who told her practical things instead of comfortable things, and who had so far done exactly what he said he would do. "How long did it take you to stop feeling like the mountains were going to swallow you?" she asked. He considered this. 2 years, he said. "Maybe a little less." "That's longer than I'd hoped." "The second winter is easier than the first," he said. "Not easy, but easier." She nodded and went back to her garden drawings. They were still finding each other, the two of them, still working out the grammar of living in close proximity to another person in a space that didn't offer much room to avoid anything. There were nights when the silence between them was companionable, and nights when it was strained, when Mara felt the particular isolation of being in a new life that didn't yet fit her shape, and she would take her lamp to the kitchen and work on something until the feeling passed. There were mornings when Caleb was short-tempered about things that turned out to have nothing to do with her. The north fence line, a sick cow, a supply delay. And she had to remind herself that his moods were not necessarily about her, which was a lesson that took longer to learn than it should have, because she had spent years in an environment where she was always the most likely explanation for any dissatisfaction. She was not Agnes, but she was not yet entirely herself here either. She was something in between, someone becoming. Spring arrived eventually, the way spring did in the high country, not with grace, but with mud and noise. The snowmelt running off the mountain in rivulets that turned the yard into a problem and turned the creek into a serious one. Mara had the garden planted by late April, working alongside Orrin and a second hand named Briggs, who had joined the ranch before winter closed in. By May, the first seedlings were coming up, and she had organized a small medicinal supply cabinet in the house that the men regarded with a mixture of skepticism and relief. The relief part started when Briggs caught his arm on a fence staple in June and came in with a wound that needed cleaning and closing. Mara cleaned it, packed it with a comfrey poultice, closed it with 3 careful stitches she'd learned from watching the Millhaven barber surgeon 2 years ago and practicing on saddle leather until her technique was decent. Briggs looked at his arm when she was done. He looked at her. "You've done that before?" he said. "Once or twice," she said. "Keep it clean and covered. Come back if it goes hot." He came back 3 days later to show her it had healed cleanly. He didn't say anything, but after that he started bringing firewood in without being asked and leaving it stacked near the kitchen door. Small things. The ranch finding its shape around her, Caleb noticed. She could tell not because he commented on it directly. He rarely commented on things directly unless something was wrong. But in the way the household's rhythms began organizing themselves around her systems rather than the improvised arrangements that had existed before. He started leaving the supply ordering for her to manage. He asked her opinion on the planting schedule for the kitchen garden before making decisions. Small transfers of authority that accumulated into something. One evening in early summer, sitting on the front step after supper while the light went gold across the valley, he said, "You're different than you were in Millhaven." She looked at him. "How?" He took a moment. "Larger," he said. "Not He caught himself and made a frustrated sound, which was unusual for him. That's not the right word. I mean, you take up the right amount of space now. You didn't before. You were contracted, like something waiting to find out if it was allowed to exist. Mara was quiet for a long time with that. I've been called a lot of things, she said finally. Nobody ever said I was contracted. Was I wrong? She looked out at the valley. The creek caught the last light and flashes. No, she said. You weren't wrong. He nodded. They sat together as the dark came in from the east, and Mara thought about the version of herself that had stood behind a counter in Mill Haven, feeling like the most possible explanation for everyone's disappointment, and thought about how far she'd walked from that place without entirely realizing she was walking. Well, the second winter was harder than the first, not in the way Caleb had promised, not emotionally, not in the sense of belonging. By the second winter, Mara had found her footing in the rhythm of the ranch, had established routines that filled the dark months with purpose rather than endurance. She had a system for everything. The men knew it and worked within it. Caleb trusted her judgment on the household and supply side with a completeness that still occasionally surprised her when she caught herself waiting for him to second-guess a decision. The second winter was harder because the weather was worse. Legitimately, recordably, historically worse. The kind of winter that old-timers would reference for decades afterward as a benchmark for badness. It started early, and it came with a viciousness that was personal in its feeling, though she knew weather was never personal. By late November, the temperature had dropped to levels that made the morning chores into a survival exercise. By December, 2 of the cattle had been lost to a cold snap that came so fast there was no getting them to shelter in time. Caleb took the cattle losses harder than she'd seen him take anything. He didn't say much about it, but she could see it in the set of his jaw and the way he stayed outside longer than the cold warranted, walking the fence lines in the dark as if the movement itself could undo what had happened. She brought him coffee one night when he came in late from a circuit of the barn. "It's not your fault," she said. "I know," he said. "That doesn't help." "No, it doesn't." She sat across from him at the kitchen table. "What would?" He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and thought about it. "Knowing we get through the rest of the winter without losing more." "Then tell me what you need for me to make that more likely," she said. He looked at her. Not surprised exactly. He'd stopped being surprised by her practicality. But something. "The north shelter needs another windbreak. The lumber is in the barn, but I've been putting it off because it's 2 days of work in this cold and I need both hands on the cattle management." "I can do the windbreak," she said. He stopped. "I can do the windbreak, Caleb." He looked at her for a long moment. "Orrin can help you," he said. "Don't do it alone." "I know," she said. "I wasn't planning to." She and Orrin built the windbreak over the following 3 days in temperatures that made her face ache and her hands clumsy inside 2 pairs of gloves. It was brutal, structural work, digging post holes in frozen ground, driving lumber, lashing the secondary panels. She came in each night barely able to open her fingers and sat by the kitchen fire until the feeling came back into her hands, and then wrote letters to Evelyn that she stacked by the door for the next time the pass was clear enough for a rider. The windbreak held. They lost no more cattle. It was January when the storm came that changed everything between them. Not a regular storm. Mara had been in the high country through 2 winters now, and she understood what a regular storm looked like. The sky did a specific thing beforehand, the clouds coming in a particular way from the northwest, and the horses felt it before any person did. A regular storm you prepared for and endured. This was different. This one arrived without proper warning, a fast-moving system that dropped the temperature 15 degrees in 2 hours and brought wind and snow together in a combination that turned the air white and cut visibility to nothing. Mara knew it was serious when she looked out the kitchen window in the mid-afternoon and couldn't see the barn. Caleb had left that morning for a supply run to the Harrow homestead, 12 miles east on the valley floor. A trip he'd done a dozen times, a trip he'd expected to complete and return from before dark. He had not returned before dark. The storm hit at 3 in the afternoon. By 5 o'clock, Mara was standing in the kitchen with the cold coming through the door gaps and the wind noise filling the whole house and a specific understanding settling into her chest like a weight. 12 miles on a valley floor in a whiteout was not 12 miles anymore. Orrin came in from the barn, frost on his hat brim, looking at her with an expression that confirmed what she already knew. "He's not going to make it back tonight in this," he said. "How bad is the Harrow Trail in this kind of storm?" she asked. Oren was quiet in a way she didn't like. "There's a section that floods when the snowmelt runs fast," he said carefully. "In this wind, the drifting can make it hard to tell where the trail edge is." "Could he get to the Harrows?" "Possibly. Probably, if his horse kept its head." "And if he didn't make it to the Harrows?" Another pause. "There's a stand of spruce about halfway. He knows the country. He'd shelter there if he needed to." Mara looked at the window and the white nothing beyond it. She thought about Caleb riding alone in this, the wind and the white 12 miles of terrain that wanted to kill you if you made one wrong reading of the ground. She thought about the cattle they'd lost in December, about his jaw set tight and his hands around the coffee cup. She thought about what he'd said that summer evening, "You take up the right amount of space now." She turned to Oren. "What do we need to go find him?" Oren stared at her. "Mrs. Whitmore, don't," she said. Her voice came out flat and certain. "I'm not asking your opinion on whether we should. I'm asking what we need. Rope, lanterns, the big draft horse because he holds his footing better than the others. What else?" Oren looked at her for a long moment. Whatever argument he'd been forming, he let it go. "Briggs," he said. "All three of us. The draft horse and 2 others. 2 coils of rope at least." "Then let's get ready," she said. She dressed in every layer she owned and still felt the cold through it when she stepped outside. The wind hit her like a physical thing, something with weight and intention. She put her head down and walked to the barn and did not think about what the temperature was doing to exposed skin or how far they were from anyone who could help if this went wrong. They left in a line, Oren leading, rope strung between the riders so they didn't lose each other in the white. Mara was in the middle, Briggs behind her. The horses moved slowly and with deep reluctance that she felt through the saddle, unhappy animals being asked to do something their instincts were screaming against. She kept one hand on the rope and one on the reins and counted her breaths to keep them even. The first 3 miles took an hour. The wind was a constant low roar that made communication nearly impossible and thought difficult in a different way. It was hard to hold a complete idea in your head when the air itself was trying to take your concentration apart. She focused on Oren's shape ahead of her, a dark form in the white, and the rope in her hand, and the horse's movement beneath her. At the 4-mile mark, Oren stopped. She pulled up beside him, and he leaned close to her ear. "Trail splits here. Harrow route goes right. The spruce stand is straight on." She thought about it. Caleb would have tried for the Harrows first, but if he'd gotten this far and the trail had gotten bad enough— "Straight on," she said. Oren didn't argue. The spruce stand materialized out of the white gradually, the dark shapes of the trees becoming visible 20 feet before they reached them, then 10. Then they were in among them, and the wind dropped from a roar to something that merely hurt. Mara pulled her horse to a stop and listened. A sound. Not wind. Something lower and intermittent. "There," Briggs said from behind her. Caleb's horse was standing between 2 large spruces, reins dropped, snow-caked and miserable, but alive. Caleb himself was on the ground at the base of the larger tree, sitting with his back against it, his head dropped forward. He had tied his coat shut around himself and pulled his hat down as far as it would go. His hands were in his armpits. Mara was off her horse before the animal fully stopped, slipping in the snow and catching herself with both hands and getting up and crossing the distance to him on foot. She grabbed his shoulder. "Caleb?" He lifted his head. His face was bad. White in places it shouldn't be, lips cracked. But his eyes focused on her, and she saw the moment recognition landed. "Mara," he said. His voice came out wrecked from the cold. "Can you move?" she said. "Are you hurt?" "Horse slipped. Threw me." He took a breath. "Ankle. Don't know how bad." "We'll figure out the ankle," she said. "Right now I need you on the horse. Can you do that with help?" "Yes," he said. It took both Oren and Briggs to get him upright and into the saddle, and it was ugly, undignified work in the dark and the cold. Caleb swearing under his breath when his ankle took weight, Oren nearly losing his own footing on the ice under the snow, Mara holding the horse steady with both hands because the animal didn't want any part of this and kept trying to shift away. When Caleb was finally up, she climbed behind him without discussion, reaching around him for the reins, her arms around his sides keeping him from swaying. He was heavier than she'd expected and colder than she wanted to think about. She could feel him shaking through his coat, the deep, involuntary shaking of someone whose body was trying to generate heat it didn't have. "Stay awake," she said close to his ear. "Talk to me." "About what?" he said. "Anything." He was quiet for a moment, then, in that wrecked voice, half lost in the wind, "I thought about you out here. I thought, she's going to be furious with me for this." "I'm not furious," she said. "You're a little furious." She gripped the reins tighter and turned the horse into the wind toward home. "I'm a lot furious," she said, "and also very glad you're alive. Both things are true at the same time." He made a sound that might, in better conditions, have been a laugh. They rode back through the dark and the white, Orin ahead with the lantern throwing weak yellow light on the snow, Briggs behind them, the rope connecting them all, and Mara's arms around her husband's shaking body the entire way back, her own face numb and her hands barely functional by the time the lights of the ranch appeared in the white, like something she'd been trying to remember the shape of. She got him inside and warm and out of his frozen clothes while Orin and Briggs took the horses. She got the fire going and the blankets piled and the broth heating that she'd had on the back of the stove since she'd realized he wasn't coming back. She assessed the ankle, badly sprained, possibly cracked along the outer edge, painful but not a threat to anything permanent, and wrapped it and elevated it and told him not to put weight on it for at least 2 weeks. He looked at her from under the pile of blankets, color coming back into his face in the uneven way of someone whose body is working very hard to correct something. "You came out in that," he said. "Yes," she said. "You could have waited until morning." "I know," she said. "Why didn't you?" She was wringing out a cloth in the hot water basin, not looking at him. She considered giving him a practical answer, something about resources and decision-making, the kind of answer she was good at. She put the cloth down. "Because I couldn't," she said. She said it plainly, without decoration, the way he had said things to her from the beginning. "I couldn't sit here and wait and not know. I couldn't do that." The room was quiet, except for the fire. "Marcia," he said. "Don't," she said. "You're concussed from the fall. Your core temperature was dangerously low an hour ago, and your ankle needs to stay elevated. Whatever you're going to say, you can say it when you're not half frozen." "I'm going to say it now," he said, with a stubbornness that she recognized because it was exactly what she would have done in the same position. "I need you to know—" He stopped, working at it. "I need you to know that when I was sitting under that tree, in that storm, what I was afraid of was not—" He stopped again. "I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of not getting back to you." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had eased slightly, as if the worst of it had said what it came to say and was winding down. Mara sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her husband's face, weathered and cracked and still carrying the white marks of the cold, and felt something settle in her chest that had been waiting for somewhere to land since the night she'd sat alone in the guest room, listening to the ranch breathe around her. "Sleep," she said. She put her hand over his. "I'll be here." He closed his eyes. She sat beside him through the night, feeding the fire and listening to his breathing even out and watching the storm diminish slowly beyond the window, and she thought, "I am not the woman who stands behind a counter, waiting for someone to notice her. I have not been that woman for some time. I just hadn't let myself know it until now." The lamp burned low, the fire held. The mountains outside were silent the way they were only after a storm had spent itself completely, a silence that meant nothing more was coming, that what had been survived. Mara Whitmore sat in that silence and did not feel small in it. Caleb's ankle kept him off it for 3 weeks, not 2. He tried for 2. On the 9th day, he came out of the bedroom in the morning, moving carefully on a makeshift crutch that Orin had cut from a birch branch, wearing the expression of a man who had decided the matter was settled. Mara looked at him from the kitchen table where she was working through the supply ledger and said nothing. She watched him cross to the window, look out at the yard, shift his weight, and go white around the mouth. "Sit down," she said. I'm fine. You're the color of the snow outside. Sit down. He sat. Not with grace, with the particular ill temper of a capable man who has been temporarily made incapable and cannot make peace with it. He put the crutch against the wall and stared at the window like the view had personally offended him. The north pasture fence needs checking after that storm, he said. Oren checked it yesterday, she said. 2 posts need resetting when the ground softens enough to work. Nothing urgent. The supply account with Harrow. I sent Briggs with the payment and the updated order 3 days ago. She didn't look up from the ledger. The cattle are fine. The barn roof held. The cold cellar has enough stores to last another 6 weeks without a supply run. You have been unconscious and then bedbound for 9 days, and nothing has fallen apart. Silence. I know, he said. Quieter now, some of the ill temper gone out of it. That's not... I know you've handled it. Then what is it? He was quiet long enough that she set down her pencil and looked at him. He was not looking at the window anymore. He was looking at his hands on the table, and his expression had shifted into something she didn't often see on him, something unguarded and not entirely comfortable. I've been lying in that room, he said, for 9 days listening to this ranch run, listening to you make decisions and manage problems and keep things moving, and I've been thinking about something you said to me before we married. You said, what do you actually want, not what you need? She waited. I want to tell you something I should have told you sooner, he said, about why I chose you. You told me, she said. You saw the way I kept the post running. You saw someone who lived in the actual world. That was true, he said, but it wasn't all of it, and I let you believe it was all of it because the rest of it was harder to say, and I'm not... He made a short, frustrated movement with one hand. I'm not a man who says things easily. You know that. I know that. I chose you because of the way you looked at me that first morning, he said. Not impressed, not performing, not trying to be the thing you thought I wanted to see. You looked at me like I was a practical problem you were assessing and hadn't decided the answer to yet. He paused. Nobody has looked at me like that in a very long time, like I was a person, not a position or a resource or an opportunity. He stopped again. I chose you because you were the first person in years who saw me instead of what I owned. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind that had been building all morning finally arrived at the window with a sound like a hand laid flat against the glass. Mara looked at her husband, at the lines of his face, the gray at his temples, the set of his jaw that was working to stay open to something it found difficult, and she felt something move in her that she didn't have a clean word for. Not surprise, exactly. It fit. It fit the way he'd looked at her that first day, the way he'd come back, the care with which he'd asked rather than assumed. It fit in the way things fit when they've been true longer than you knew to name them. You could have told me that, she said. I know, he said, earlier. I know, he said again, instead of letting me wonder for 2 years whether I was primarily a useful arrangement. He looked up at her. Did you actually wonder that? She held his gaze. Sometimes. He absorbed this like a man taking a piece of information seriously enough to sit with it. I'm sorry, he said. I should have been clearer. Yes, she said. You should have. They looked at each other across the kitchen table in the gray winter light, and it was not a comfortable moment. It was better than that. It was the kind of moment that was uncomfortable specifically because it was real, because they were both showing up to it as actual people with actual histories and actual failures of communication. And that was harder than comfort, but worth considerably more. Go back to bed, she said finally. Your ankle needs another week at minimum. I'll bring you the supply ledger so you have something to do. He picked up the crutch. Mara. What? Thank you for coming out in that storm. He said it looking directly at her. I know I said it before. I want to say it again properly. You're welcome, she said. Don't make me do it again. The corner of his mouth moved. I'll try. Spring came like an argument that eventually got settled. By March, the worst of the winter had broken, the pass opened enough for riders to get through, and Millhaven became accessible again after nearly 4 months of practical isolation. The first letter from Evelyn arrived in a packet of mail that Briggs brought back from the valley, thick with paper that had been written over multiple sittings, the handwriting changing slightly between paragraphs in ways that told Mara her sister had picked it up and put it down a dozen times before finishing it. She read it at the kitchen table, and what she felt reading it was complicated in the good way. Evelyn had written about the post, about Clara's health, about a man named Garrett, who had been coming around since November, and who Evelyn described with a careful neutrality that meant she was interested and wasn't ready to say so. She wrote about the winter in Millhaven, which had been severe by valley standards, and about how she'd managed the accounts herself for the first time, and had found, this sentence was underlined, that she was better at it than she'd thought. She wrote, "I think I spent a long time believing I wasn't the kind of person who could manage things. I'm beginning to think I believe that because everyone needed me to be the pretty one, and it was easier not to complicate the arrangement. I'm sorry I let that be easier for so long." Mara read that sentence twice. Then she got a clean sheet of paper and wrote back at length, her longest letter yet, filling both sides and starting a third. She wrote about the storm and the rescue and Caleb's ankle. She wrote about the windbreak she and Orrin had built in the cold. She wrote about the way the ranch looked in February, when the mountains were their most serious and the valley below caught the low sun in a way that turned everything briefly golden before the shadow came back. She wrote about what Caleb had said in the kitchen, not because she needed to explain herself, but because she wanted Evelyn to understand. It was real. What she'd built up here was real, and it had been built by both of them, and it was nothing like anything either of them had been raised to expect a life to look like. She wrote, "I think we were both assigned roles before we were old enough to argue. I think mine was the invisible one, and yours was the beautiful one, and neither of us ever asked whether those were the roles we actually wanted. I know I didn't ask. I just got quiet and carried things." She paused with the pen, looking out the window at the mountain behind the house, still white at the top, but beginning to show dark rock lower down where the melt was starting. She wrote, "I don't carry things the same way anymore. I'm learning to put them down when they're not mine to hold. It's slower work than I expected." She folded the letter and put it with the others, waiting for the next rider south. News from Millhaven arrived with that first spring mail packet in other ways too, and not all of it was Evelyn's careful handwriting. There was a letter from Clara, brief and factual, which mentioned, among other things, that a man named Reg Caldwell had been asking questions about the Blackwood Post. Not buying questions. Different questions. Questions about the original land grant, about the survey lines, about whether Clara had documentation for the eastern boundary of the property. Mara read this once, then read it again, then set it flat on the table and looked at it. Reg Caldwell was a land speculator who had been moving through the territory for 2 years, accumulating properties the way some men accumulated grievances, methodically, without heat, making sure the paperwork was on his side before he made any move that could be contested. She'd heard his name in the Post more than once, always in the context of someone who had walked away from a transaction feeling like they'd miscounted the cards. He worked legally. That was what made him dangerous. He didn't break laws. He found the places where laws weren't clear and stood in those places until they resolved in his favor. The eastern boundary of the Blackwood Post property had never been formally resurveyed since her father's original grant, which had been registered in 1847 using measurements that were approximate at best, and which contained, as Mara knew because she had read every document in that post at least twice, a description of the eastern line that referenced a creek that had shifted its course by about 40 feet since the measurement was taken. 40 feet of boundary discrepancy was not much, unless someone decided it mattered, unless someone with money and lawyers decided to make it matter. She brought the letter to Caleb that evening. He read it, said nothing for a while, and then, "You know what he's doing." "I know what he's doing," she said. "Does your mother have the original grant documents?" "She should. They were in the back office lockbox when I left." Mara paused. "But if Caldwell's already asking questions, he's already talked to a surveyor. He's building a case before he makes a move, so when he does move, there's no time to respond." Caleb set the letter down. "What do you need from me?" She had already been thinking about this since she'd read Clara's letter the first time, running through it the way she ran through supply problems. What's at risk? What's the timeline? What can be done? I need to go to Millhaven, she said. He looked at her. Not to rescue her, Mara said. Clara doesn't need rescuing. She needs someone who understands the paperwork and can move faster than Caldwell expects. If I can get there before he files anything formal, we can get an independent survey done and close the boundary question before it becomes a legal dispute. That's a week's round trip with the pass the way it is, Caleb said. I know. The calving is starting in 10 days. I know that too. She met his eyes. I'm not asking permission, Caleb. I'm telling you what I'm going to do and asking whether you can manage the calving start without me. He was quiet for a moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not resistance. Something more like recognition, like a man watching someone become exactly who they were always going to be. Orrin and Briggs can handle the first week, he said. I'll be on the ankle by then. Go. She left 2 days later. Millhaven looked smaller. That was the first thing she noticed, riding in from the north on a morning that was cold but clear. The kind of March day that made promises it would spend the next 2 months slowly keeping. The town looked smaller than the version she'd been carrying in her head for the past year and a half. The main street shorter, the buildings lower. The trading post, when it came into view, looked like a thing that had been surviving on stubbornness more than structure. She felt a complicated love for it anyway. Clara came out the front door before Mara had finished tying the horse, moving faster than her bad back usually allowed. And what she did was not what Mara expected. She didn't say anything immediately. She just put her arms around Mara and held on, and Mara stood there in the cold with her mother's arms around her and thought, she's gotten smaller too. That's not the building. People get smaller when you're not watching them every day. You look different, Clara said, stepping back, looking at her face. I've been working outside, Mara said. It's not that. Clara studied her with the specific attention of a woman who had been watching this daughter her entire life without always seeing what she was looking at. You stand different. Mara didn't answer that. Tell me about Caldwell. They went inside. Evelyn was behind the counter. She looked at Mara for a moment, and something passed between them that didn't need words. 17 months of letters, and the particular knowledge that comes from two people being honest with each other on paper in ways they hadn't managed in person for years. Then Evelyn came around the counter and hugged her, and it was quick and real and nothing like performance. The lockbox is in the back, Evelyn said. I pulled the original documents when Mama wrote you. They're in order. Good, Mara said. I need the survey description and the water rights registration. Already on top. Mara looked at her sister. Evelyn's expression held a competence that hadn't been there when Mara left. Something steadier in the set of her. A woman who had been running accounts through a hard winter and had discovered she was capable of it. You've been managing the books, Mara said. Someone had to, Evelyn said. Turned out I have a head for numbers. Who knew? I knew, Mara said. Evelyn's expression did something quick and complicated and then settled. The man Mama mentioned, Garrett. She said it with a careful casualness that didn't fool anyone. He's been helpful. He knows surveyors. Tell me about Garrett, Mara said. Later. Caldwell first. Reg Caldwell came into the post the following morning as if he'd known she would be there, which meant someone in Millhaven had told him, which meant he had someone in Millhaven who told him things. This was useful information. He was a composed man in his late 40s, medium height, the kind of unremarkable that was its own kind of strategy. He wore good clothes without being flashy about them, and he had a lawyer's hands, smooth, unhurried, never doing anything that suggested nervousness. He looked at Mara behind the counter and adjusted his estimate of the situation by a fraction, which she caught because she was watching for it. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, I heard you were back in town. I hoped we might have a chance to talk. Mr. Caldwell, she said, I imagine you did. He smiled. It was a professional smile, the kind that didn't carry feeling in either direction. I've been looking into the property situation here. Some questions about the eastern boundary that I think the family would want to address before they become complications. Specifically a 40-foot creek drift in the 1847 survey description, she said. His smile held, but something behind it recalibrated. You're familiar with the discrepancy. I've been familiar with it since I was 19, she said. My father's original grant description was imprecise at the eastern line. We've known that. What we've also known is that imprecision in a founding survey description doesn't automatically transfer title. It creates a question that gets answered by a current independent survey, which we have commissioned. She said the last part without breaking pace, watching his face. The surveyor arrives from Billings on Thursday. We expect his findings to formalize the boundary as it has existed in practice for 31 years. The pause that followed was short, but she heard everything in it. You've commissioned a survey already, he said. We have, she said. He looked at her steadily. That's a significant expense for a post operating under the financial conditions this one has been. We've secured financing, she said. This was partly true. She had written to Caleb before she left the ranch. His response, which Briggs had ridden to meet her with on the trail, had been 3 sentences. Handle it however you need to. Use the ranch account. Tell me what happens. Caldwell absorbed this. He was a man who worked in information, and the information he was working with had just shifted significantly. He had expected to find a widow and a girl in difficult circumstances who didn't understand what a boundary discrepancy meant for their position. He had found Mara. Well, he said, I suppose we'll see what the survey turns up. We will, she said. Was there something else I could help you with today? He bought a length of rope he didn't need and left. Clara, who had been in the back room during the entire exchange, appeared in the doorway the moment the bell above the door stopped moving. She was holding the invoice ledger to her chest like a shield. He'll find another angle, she said. He might, Mara said, but this was the angle he'd prepared. He'll need time to find another one, and time is what we needed. She started making notes. When the surveyor comes Thursday, I want you and Evelyn both present for the entire assessment. Write down everything. If Caldwell challenges the findings, we want a record of the process. You're not staying for it? Clara asked. I need to be back for the calving. She looked up. But Evelyn can handle it. She knows the documents. Clara looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked back with the expression of someone who had already decided. I can handle it, Evelyn said. Clara opened her mouth and closed it, and then said, with the particular tone of a woman surrendering a position she'd held longer than it was useful. All right. It was a small thing, but Mara had spent enough time managing small things to know that most large things were made of them. She stayed 5 days in Millhaven, long enough for the surveyor to arrive and begin his preliminary assessment, long enough to walk him through the eastern boundary herself and answer his technical questions and make sure he understood exactly what they needed documented and why. Long enough for Duval to run into her on the main street and stop dead in his tracks and say, Well, you look like someone who's been somewhere that agreed with them. I have, she said. He shook his head slowly, the same way he'd shaken it a year and a half ago outside the trading post, but the quality was different now. Less baffled, more something that had the shape of respect in it. Whitmore's a lucky man, he said. We're both lucky, she said. It just doesn't look the way luck usually looks. She spent an evening with Evelyn and the man named Garrett, who turned out to be a quietly capable person who had indeed been helpful and who looked at Evelyn with a directness that suggested he had also made a decision and was not being theatrical about it. Mara liked him immediately, for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate, except that he seemed to see Evelyn rather than perform seeing her, which was exactly what Evelyn deserved and had perhaps for the first time in her life specifically needed. After Garrett left that evening, Evelyn sat across from Mara at the kitchen table and said, Well? He's good, Mara said. Evelyn's exhale was more relief than she'd probably meant to show. I think so. Don't perform it, Mara said. If it's real, let it be real. Evelyn looked at her, a small smile, genuine. That's Caleb's lesson. It's both our lessons, Mara said. She left on the 5th day, in the early morning before the town was fully awake. Clara stood on the front step of the post and watched her mount, and her face held the look of a woman looking at something she'd underestimated for too long and was only now fully seeing. Come back in summer, Clara said. Bring your husband. We will, Mara said. She rode north, and the mountains grew larger in front of her as she went, and she did not feel what she'd feared she might feel leaving again. That wrenching thing, the sense of a life pulling in two directions. She felt herself moving towards something, not away from it. The post grew small behind her and disappeared into the distance, and she thought about the girl who had stood behind its counter for years doing necessary invisible work, and felt something for that girl that was close to tenderness. She had not been wrong to carry things. She had just been carrying them in the wrong place for the wrong people, or rather in a place that hadn't known how to see what she was doing. The ranch was 40 miles ahead. Caleb was there, and the calving and the spring mud, and all the particular complications of a life that was hers in a way nothing had ever quite been hers before. She put her head down against the wind and rode. She made it back to the ranch in 2.5 days, pushing harder than was strictly comfortable, because the calving couldn't wait on anyone's schedule, and she'd already been gone 5 days. Caleb was in the barn when she rode in, which she'd expected. What she hadn't expected was the calf. 2 days early, breech, and by the look of things, he'd been working the problem for several hours. He had his sleeves rolled and his arms were a mess, and he looked up when she came through the barn door with an expression that mixed relief and exhaustion in equal measure. "How bad?" she said. "She's going to be fine. Calf is fine. It was bad 2 hours ago." He straightened, rolling his shoulders. "How's the post?" The surveyor was good. Caldwell backed off. She tied her horse, stripped her coat, grabbed the clean rags hanging from the barn wall. Evelyn handled herself. "She's going to be all right." "I knew she would be," he said. She looked at him. "You don't know her." "I know her sister," he said. "I figured it ran in the family." She didn't say anything to that, but she felt it settle somewhere it needed to settle, and she went to work beside him cleaning up the aftermath of a difficult birth, and the barn smelled of hay and warm animal and cold air coming through the wall gaps, and none of it was romantic, but all of it was real, and she had stopped needing those two things to be the same. Spring that year was one of the good ones. Not easy. The high country didn't do easy as a category, but the kind of spring that paid back some of what the winter had taken. The calving went well. The garden came up strong, the yarrow and comfrey thicker than the year before, the willow saplings she'd planted establishing themselves along the creek bank. Orrin built the rest of the fence line she'd planned in February, and Briggs, who had turned out to be a harder worker than his first impression suggested, took over the winter supply logging with a system Mara taught him that he improved on in 2 specific ways she hadn't considered. She noticed that and told him so. He went red to the ears, which was not something she'd seen Briggs do, and said, "Just seemed more logical." "It is more logical," she said. "I'm using your version." He was more useful after that, in the way people become more useful when someone pays actual attention to what they're capable of. That was something she'd learned in pieces over the past 2 years. That capability in people was rarely obvious from the outside. It required conditions. It required someone looking at you in a way that assumed you had something worth finding, rather than looking for confirmation of what they'd already decided you were. She thought about this sometimes when she was working, the way a mind turns something over and over until it starts to feel less like a thought and more like something you know in your bones. She had needed someone to look at her that way. Caleb had. And the version of herself that had emerged from being seen clearly was a different woman from the one who'd stood behind that counter in Millhaven keeping accounts that nobody credited her for. The question she kept coming back to was not why she'd needed that. The question was why it was so rare. She didn't have a clean answer. She just knew it was. And she knew that the rarity of it made her careful now about how she looked at people. The men who worked the ranch, the riders who passed through, the families at the Harrow homestead 12 miles east, who had become something approaching neighbors in the high country sense of that word. She looked at them with the assumption that there was more than what she could immediately see, because she knew what it was to have more than you could show, and no one bothering to look. The letter from Evelyn that arrived in early June carried news on 2 fronts. The survey had been completed and filed. The boundary was formalized as it had stood in practice for 31 years. Caldwell had made no further moves on the Blackwood property, and according to Evelyn's sources, which had improved considerably since she'd started keeping regular company with Garrett, who seemed to know most of what happened in the valley before it happened, had turned his attention toward a property dispute in Hargrove instead. Mara read that part twice and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't entirely realized she'd been holding since March. The second piece of news was that Evelyn and Garrett intended to marry in September, and would Mara and Caleb come down for it. She brought the letter to Caleb that evening. He read it and handed it back. "September is good," he said, "after the summer work, before the first snow." "She asked if we'd come," Mara said. "Not assumed, asked." "Is that significant?" Mara folded the letter along its crease. "For Evelyn, yes. She's asking because she actually wants the answer, not because she's assuming the answer is whatever works for her." She looked at the letter in her hands. "She's changed." "So have you," Caleb said. "I know," she said. "I think that's the point." She wrote back that evening. Yes, they would come. Yes, she was glad. Yes, she had opinions about the dress fabric and the preserves for the table, and she was putting all of them in the next letter so Evelyn could ignore the ones she disagreed with and use the ones she didn't. She wrote 3 pages and started a 4th, and then put the pen down and just sat for a moment with the lamp and the quiet. She thought about the version of herself that had read Evelyn's wedding correspondence a different way 2 years ago, with the particular weight of someone watching good things happen at a distance, from outside the frame of things that were meant for her. She was not that woman anymore. She didn't know exactly when the shift had completed itself, whether it was the storm or the kitchen conversation or the moment she'd walked into Caldwell's careful professional presence and found, to her own mild surprise, that she was not afraid of him. Maybe it had been all of it together. Maybe it had been none of it specifically, and all of it gradually, the way a season changes. Not on a single day, but over the accumulation of days until one morning you look outside and the thing that was one thing is now another. They went down to Millhaven for the September wedding. The town had changed in the way towns changed when you'd been away long enough. The same, but with details shifted, like furniture rearranged in a familiar room. There was a new storefront where the vacant lot had been. 2 buildings had been repainted. The road coming in from the north had been graded, which made the last mile considerably more pleasant than it had ever been in Mara's memory. People noticed her. Not with the invisible, not noticing that she'd spent years navigating. The way a room rearranges its attention around a person it has decided doesn't count. This was different. People looked at her and found something to say that was not about Evelyn, not comparative, not filtered through her sister's reflected light. Mrs. Garfield, who 2 years ago had said within earshot that Caleb must have wanted someone who'd do the cooking without complaining, came across the main street specifically to greet her and said, with what appeared to be genuine rather than performed warmth, "Mara, you look well. I hear the ranch has done extraordinary things since you came up there." Mara looked at her. She did not say what she might have once said, which was something deflecting and self-minimizing, the verbal equivalent of making herself smaller. She said, "It's been hard work and good work. We're proud of it." Mrs. Garfield blinked at the directness of this and then recovered and said something about the calving numbers she'd heard mentioned, and Mara answered her questions and moved on. And what she felt walking away was not the old, complicated mixture of resentment and gratitude that attention from this woman had always produced before. She felt essentially nothing about it, which was its own kind of freedom. Caleb, walking beside her, said nothing until they were past the general store. "She tried to apologize," he said. "I know." "You didn't make it easy for her." Mara glanced at him. "I wasn't rude." "No, but you didn't perform gratitude either." "I'm not grateful," she said. "I'm not angry either. I just don't need anything from her anymore." She thought about this. That's the thing about being seen, eventually, by the right people. It stops mattering as much when the wrong ones finally get around to looking. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That took me a long time to learn," he said. "What did?" "That the people who failed to see me when it counted don't get credit for seeing me after I proved myself." He said it without particular heat, just a fact he'd arrived at. They're responding to evidence. That's not the same as faith. She looked at him walking beside her. This man she had married practically and had come to love in the specific, non-decorative way that happened when 2 people showed up as themselves in difficult conditions and found they were still standing at the end of it. "Did someone fail to see you?" she asked. She realized she didn't know the full answer to this, that there were still stories in him she hadn't reached. My father, he said, after a pause. He thought the ranch was a young man's foolishness, thought I'd fail inside of a year and come back. Another pause. He died before the third winter. Never came to see it. She took that in. I'm sorry. I'm not looking for sorry, he said. I know what you felt behind that counter. I know it from a different angle. He looked ahead down the main street. I built everything I have trying to prove something to a man who wasn't there to see it. Took me a long time to figure out I was doing that, and longer to stop. What made you stop? He glanced at her sideways. You want the honest answer? I always want the honest answer. You, he said, watching you refuse to make yourself small for people who didn't deserve the effort. It reminded me that carrying proof around is heavy, and the people who needed convincing were either already gone or were never going to be convinced anyway. She thought about that for the rest of the walk to the post. Evelyn's wedding was held in the afternoon, in the open air behind the trading post where Mara and her sister had knelt together cutting yarrow in the cold 2 years ago. The space had been cleaned and strung with lanterns that weren't lit yet in the afternoon light, but would matter later. Clara stood straight-backed and composed and wept at the correct moments, and also at a few incorrect ones, which was more honest than the composed version. Garrett was steady throughout, which was the main thing you needed from a man at a wedding. He looked at Evelyn with the specific attention of someone who understood what he was getting. Not a performance, not an ideal, but a particular woman with a particular history and particular capabilities that he had bothered to learn. Mara stood to Evelyn's left during the ceremony and watched her sister's face and thought, she's found what I found. Not the same thing, not the same shape. Garrett and Caleb were different men, and Evelyn and Mara were different women, and that was exactly as it should be. But the same principle. Someone who looked at the actual person and made a decision based on that. She thought about the girls they had both been in this same building, assigned to their roles before they understood they could refuse them. The beautiful one and the invisible one. The one people looked at and the one who did the looking after. She thought about how long both of them had lived inside those assignments as if they were facts of nature rather than habits of perception that could be interrupted, changed, refused. She thought, the cruelest thing about being underestimated is that eventually you start doing it to yourself. After the ceremony, when the lanterns were lit and the food was out and people were talking in the way people talked at events that had gone well, Duvall found her near the table where the preserves were arranged. He had a cup of something and the look of a man who had been composing a sentence for a while. I told you I hoped you'd prove me wrong, he said. I remember, she said. I was wrong, he said, about all of it. About the ranch being too hard for you, about Whitmore making a strange choice, about... He stopped, started again, with the awkward honesty of someone who didn't often do this. I had an idea of what you were, and it wasn't right. I want you to know I know that. She looked at him. He wasn't young, and he wasn't comfortable doing this, and the discomfort was visible, which made the doing of it mean more. Thank you, Nate, she said. I mean that. He nodded, relieved to have said the thing and been received without drama. He wandered back toward the food, and she let him go. Caleb appeared at her shoulder shortly after, with the instinct he'd developed for finding her in crowded spaces. What did Duvall want? To apologize, she said. How was it? Genuine, she said, which made it matter. She picked up her cup. He'd built an idea of me, and he was honest enough to say it was wrong. That's harder than it sounds. Caleb leaned against the post beside her, looking out at the gathered people. He's not the only one who built the wrong idea, he said. She followed his gaze across the yard to where Clara was standing talking to a neighbor woman, laughing at something, looking in that moment more relaxed than Mara had seen her in years. The post's financial situation had stabilized. The Caldwell threat resolved. Evelyn proving herself capable with the accounts. The modest income improvement that had come in part from better supply negotiation that Mara had set in motion before she left. She did what she thought she had to do, Mara said. She assigned us the roles she thought gave us the best chance. That doesn't make the roles right. No, she said, but it makes her human. She watched her mother laugh at something else. I spent a long time being angry at her for not seeing me clearly. I'm not sure that was fair. She was trying to survive, same as everyone else. She just used the tools she had. Caleb said nothing for a moment. When did you stop being angry? She considered it honestly. Somewhere around the second winter, I think. When I realized I was building something real and the anger was taking up space I needed for other things. She paused. Anger is useful for a while. It tells you something's wrong, but you have to eventually decide what you're going to do besides be angry, or it just eats the room. He nodded slowly, and she could see him taking that and setting it beside something in himself, the way he did when something landed correctly. They stayed in Millhaven 4 days, long enough for Mara to spend real time with Clara, not managed time, not careful time, but actual time, sitting in the kitchen after supper, going through the accounts together the way they hadn't in the 2 years since Mara left. Clara's bookkeeping had improved under necessity. She'd made decisions Mara wouldn't have made, and some of them had been better than Mara's would have been, and she told her mother so. Clara looked at her when she said it. Something moved in her face. "You've always been the one," Clara said. "I want you to know I knew that, even when I didn't act like I knew it." "I know," Mara said. "I should have said it more." "Yes," Mara said. She didn't add anything softening to that. It was true, and softening it would have been dishonest, and they were past the point in their relationship where dishonesty was a kindness. Clara accepted the plain truth the way she'd always accepted necessary things, with a tightness around the mouth, and then a release of it, like a door opening. "Come back more," Clara said. "Don't let the past keep you away the whole winter without writing." "I write all winter," Mara said. "More," Clara said. "I read them twice each." Mara looked at her mother and felt something warm and imperfect and exactly right. The specific feeling of a relationship that had been damaged and repaired and was now a different shape than it had originally been, smaller in some places and larger in others, honest in ways it hadn't been before. Not healed, exactly. More like adjusted. More like two people who had finally stopped pretending the old shape still fit. "I'll write more," she said. They rode north on the 5th morning, and this time Mara did look back. She looked back at the trading post, at its cracked boards and the new paint on the front, where Evelyn had apparently decided one thing didn't have to keep looking tired just because everything else was. She looked at the main street of Millhaven coming to life in the early morning, the general store opening its shutters, a cart making its way from the south end, smoke rising from the boarding house chimney. She looked at the mountains ahead of her, growing and growing as she rode toward them, and she looked back once more at the place she'd come from. She had not been wrong to leave. She had not been wrong to stay gone. She had been exactly right to come back and to leave again, and to keep moving in the direction of what was real. The trail curved north and Millhaven dropped behind the tree line, and then it was just the two of them and the mountain country opening up ahead, familiar now in the way places become familiar when you have moved through them in every season and every kind of weather, when you have learned their specific dangers and their specific gifts. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked, sometime after the first hour. It was not a question he asked often. He was not a man who filled silence with conversation for its own sake, which she had come to appreciate in the particular way you appreciated things that matched your own nature. When he asked, he was actually asking. "I'm thinking about what I'm going to plant in the south section this fall," she said. "And I'm thinking about the storeroom reorganization I've been putting off. And I'm thinking—" She paused, looked at the trail ahead. "I'm thinking about a girl who spent years being the invisible one and believed it because everyone around her did. I'm thinking about how long it takes to stop believing the things that were decided about you before you had any say." "Did you stop?" he asked. "Mostly," she said. "There are mornings." She was quiet for a moment. "There are mornings when I wake up and the old voice is there first. The one that says, 'You don't get to have this. It's going to be taken back. You weren't meant for something this solid.'" She looked over at him. "I don't think that voice goes away entirely. I think you just get better at knowing it's lying." Caleb rode for a while without speaking. The trail narrowed around a rock face and they went single file, and when it widened again, he came back alongside her. "I have that voice too," he said. "The ranch," she said. Not a question. "The ranch, the men. Whether I've built something that actually holds or whether I've just been lucky in the years it hasn't fallen." He said it with the flatness of someone reporting a recurring weather pattern. I don't say that to most people. I know you don't. It helps, he said, that you're there. When the voice starts in the dark at 3 in the morning, it helps that you're an actual person who is actually there and the thing we've built is real enough to touch. She thought about that for a long time, about what it meant to be someone's evidence that a real life was happening, about how that was not a small thing, about how it was in fact the thing she'd always wanted to be without knowing how to say it. Not decoration, not a solution to a practical problem, not the invisible necessary one. Just real. Present. Evidence. The mountains grew around them as they climbed, the air thinning and cooling, the trees changing their character from the valley cottonwoods to the high country spruce and pine that she had come to know the way you knew the faces of people you lived alongside. The ranch appeared in the late afternoon with its particular settled-in-the-land quality that she'd noticed the very first time she saw it, the way it didn't fight the landscape but negotiated with it. Orrin came out of the barn when he heard the horses. He looked at them both and said, "Calf you've been watching took sick yesterday. She's stable now, I think, but you'll want to look at her." They both went directly to the barn. That was the homecoming. Not ceremony, not sentiment, a sick calf and two people going to look at her together, immediately, because the work was always there and you went to the work, and the work was also the life, and the life was also the work. And somewhere in the years of doing it together, a love had built itself out of all those practical, unglamorous materials that was more solid than anything she'd ever imagined for herself in those years behind the trading post counter. She checked the calf, assessed her, adjusted the treatment Orrin had started. The calf was going to be fine. These things, sometimes, were going to be fine. Later, when the barn work was done and supper was finished and the ranch had gone quiet for the night, Mara stood at the east window in the bedroom, the window positioned to catch the morning light, that detail that had told her something about the man who built this house, and looked out at the mountains in the dark. The scar on her cheek was there, same as always, same as it would always be. Her body was what it was, wide and strong and built for the work she had put it to, and she had stopped apologizing for it somewhere in the second winter when there was too much actual work to do to spend energy on apology. The world had decided things about women who looked like her, and those decisions had shaped the first 26 years of her life in ways she was still occasionally discovering. She did not pretend those years hadn't happened or that the shaping hadn't cost her something. It had. That was simply true. But here was also true. She was 30 years old, and she had built something. Not alone. She was honest enough to know that Caleb's faith had been the condition that made it possible, and that Orrin's steadiness and Briggs's quiet usefulness and even Evelyn's late-arriving understanding had all been part of it. People needed people. She'd been trying to do without for so long that she'd mistaken the isolation for self-sufficiency. The difference, she'd learned, was not whether you needed others. Everyone needed others. The difference was whether the people around you were the kind who saw you clearly and worked alongside you honestly, or the kind who needed you to be a certain thing and couldn't adjust when you turned out to be something larger. She had found the first kind. She had built a life with them. That life was not perfect. It was muddy and difficult and cold in winter, and she still woke up some mornings with the old lying voice already waiting, but it was solid under her feet in the specific way that mattered, the way that meant she could put her weight on it without wondering if it would hold. Caleb's voice came from the other side of the room. "Come to bed. The calf will still be there in the morning." "I know," she said. She didn't move immediately. She looked at the dark mountains one more moment, at the sky above them crowded with stars, the way the sky only was this far from any town, and she thought, this is mine. Not just the ranch, the whole arrangement, the work, the man, the life, the hard winters, the east window in the morning. This is what I chose, and what chose me back. She turned away from the window. "I'm coming," she said. The mountains stood silent outside, the same as they had stood for 1,000 years before she arrived, and would stand for 1,000 after. They did not care about the scar on her face, or the width of her body, or what a town in the valley below had once decided she was worth. The mountains had simply waited for someone willing to stay. And Mara Whitmore had turned out to be exactly that,